Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of the Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, which provides you the much important avenue to practice daily answer writing, in the first topic, we'll try to analyze the grassroots level implementation of the 6 agricultural schemes which were launched in this year's budget of 2025. Then, in the second topic, we'll try to address the issues which still prevails in the Right of Person with Disabilities Act of 2016 in the light of a recent article which has highlighted an abysmal reflection of disabled people in the government post. Then, in your simplified section, we'll take up 5 news. We will not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide you the much important value addition keeping in mind the approaching prelims 2026. So, stay tuned. As the first half of the current fiscal year, that is from the month of April to September, now draws to close, the 6 new agricultural schemes which were actually announced in this year budget of 2025 to 26 are yet to hit the ground, which basically implies that these schemes are yet to be implemented at the grassroots level. So this is another classic case of showmanship versus statesmanship which actually prevails in the politics, where a lot of such new schemes are actually announced during the election cycle or in the launch of the budget, but none of them actually translates with the spirit of later at the grassroots level. So, we are going to cover each of these schemes and the issues which they address in detail. But first, let's start by understanding the snapshot on the agricultural sector, which is also very helpful for your prelims examination. The agriculture sector, which is considered the largest employer in our country as it employs 46% of our country's current workforce. Remember that India holds the epithet of being the largest producer of milk, pulse and jute as per the economic survey of 2025, and we are second largest producer of rice, wheat and sugarcane in the world. At the same time, when it comes to agriculture production, we are ranked second in the world after China, and in agricultural exports, our total export in the year of 2024 to 25 fiscal year was around $51 billion, making our country the fourth largest agricultural exporter in the world. In this backdrop, in the budget 2025, the government launches a new scheme. The name of the scheme is Dhan Dhanya Krishi Yojana 2025, to be implemented in a mission mode from the year of 2025 to 2031, which has actually been kind of designed on the basis of aspirational district program of Niti Aayog, where the Ministry of Agriculture is now going to target the 100 low performing districts in the country. These particular districts are particularly performing low or abysmal in which particular fields? That becomes the question. So the kind of the idea in which we are going to actually kind of do the improvements, that is going to be on the basis of the districts which are facing low productivity and low cropping intensity, as well as less credit disbursement at the district level. The idea is that the provisions of these schemes is actually going to benefit 1.7 crore farmers directly. So, what this particular scheme is actually trying to hit at? What is the issue? The first issue is the prevailing low crop productivity and crop intensity in our country. So, to understand about a particular person, that this particular person is right now at which position in his life and where he might end up. To kind of understand the trajectory of this person, it is very important to understand from where this person is actually coming from. That is the reason why you guys read history when you guys are preparing for bureaucracy. So, we are going to take a kind of a historical backdrop of this particular kind of the agricultural productivity which we have across the years since our independence to actually understand that why the crop yield is significantly declining in our country. So, you guys can recall that when we got our independence in the year of 1947, thanks to the exploitative revenue policies of the Britishers, like for example permanent settlement system, or for example the commercialization of agriculture which had taken place, which had actually kind of reduced down our country to a raw material producing country, where we were producing raw materials like for example jute, cotton, rubber, etc. for the industries of Lancashire, Manchester, London. So because of such exploitative policies of the Britishers, when India got independent, at that point of time, we were actually facing a lot of famines. So in this context, you guys can recall the 1876 to 78 Great Famine, in which only 6.1 million people perished. That is almost 12 times more than the official deaths in our country which occurred during the time period of pandemic. Or for example, you guys can recall the famine of 1941 to 43 which ravaged the state of Bengal. At the same point of time, because of the result of the partition which took place, because of that, the fertile tracts adjoining the river basins of Indus, Chenab, Jhelum were actually diverted toward the region of Pakistan, the formalization of which has taken place through Indus Water Treaty of 1960. Thus, at that point of time, our country was actually facing decline in the crop productivity, specifically in the staple crops. The staple crops which basically act as food for us, like for example, rice, wheat, pulses, etc. Thus, at that point of time, we were heavily import dependent for our own food security. So in this context, you guys can recall the import of PL 480 wheat which we were doing from the state of USA, and this particular supply or import was actually curtailed by USA when our country actually supported the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971. Thus making our policymakers actually envisage to increase our food productivity. They brought a new scheme, and that was the Green Revolution, where the government basically started incentivizing the farmers to adopt high yield variety seeds as well as various kind of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. The reason for that was to actually increase the crop productivity and achieve food sustainability for our country. But the farmers were apprehensive. They said that okay, till now we are following a kind of a traditional agricultural system. When we are diverting to these high yield variety seeds and adopting more chemical fertilizer and pesticides, don't you think that the input cost is actually going to increase? And if the input cost is actually going to increase, then our profit margin is actually going to decline. Thus, the farmers, they basically started demanding for a kind of a statutory backing by the government, and that led the government to provide such assurance by launching minimum support price in the year of 1967. So the government said that okay, we are going to provide a kind of a floor price for 23 crops. So if the market price will fall below that, the farmers, they are basically assured by the government that we are going to procure this crop at a floor price. So the farmers will not incur any kind of substantial loss if they are producing these crops. Now, these two initiatives, the Green Revolution and the assurance by MSP, actually kind of led to have detrimental impact on our agricultural economy. To understand that, let's first refer to the data which has been provided to us by the Ministry of Agriculture itself, that for the procurement cycle for the fiscal year of 2022 to 23, the total food procurement which the government did, approximately 120 to 130 million ton. Why? Because under National Food Security Act 2013, the government is providing subsidized food to almost 75% of the population. For that, the government also requires food, and that the government is procuring at the MSP. 95% of this procurement was actually constrained to only two crops, and those were rice and wheat. So don't you think that if the government is only providing assurance for these crops, the farmers are actually incentivized to grow these highly water intensive crops? Thus, it led to an issue in our agriculture economy, and that is the issue of culture of monocropping. At the same time, when the government was incentivizing fertilizer uses, pesticide uses, the government subsidized them. So for example, even till today, urea is subsidized by the government, and thus it is the most procured, used and imported fertilizer of our country, leading to the excessive use of pesticide and parallelly the declining crop yield, which you guys can see here from the years of Green Revolution itself. The crop productivity per hectare has significantly declined over the course of years. Why it has happened? Because of the harmful impact of fertilizer. So, when we are using these fertilizers, when this fertilizer mixes with the water, it basically releases H plus ions. So these fertilizers, they basically contain what? They contain ammonium phosphate or they contain ammonium sulfate. So when this ammonium phosphate or sulfate mixes with the water, it releases H plus ions. And these hydrogen ions, when they mix with soil, they basically starts declining the pH level of soil, and thus the soil starts getting acidified. The soil acidification takes place. Because of this soil acidification, the essential nutrients which prevails, the organic nutrients which already prevails in the soil, like for example iron, zinc, folic acid, these are basically the micronutrients. These micronutrients, they start declining, and thus the crop productivity declines. Now let's say for example, if the crop in a certain area is declining, the root penetration, which actually kind of digs inside the soil and holds the soil, these roots are also declining. So even at the minute inconvenience, let's say for example high intensity of wind blowing or any flash flood taking place, the soil erosion is taking place altogether. Also, when the soil acidifies, basically let's say for example, let's create this particular profile of a field of soil. So in this particular area, if the acidification is increasing, the idea is that it will start creating salt flakes. Because of these increasing salt flakes in this soil profile, don't you think that the soil is actually becoming more compactable? Thus the root penetration is actually declining. At the same point of time, the rainwater which is falling in this particular soil profile, don't you think it will be unable to percolate and kind of recharge the underground water? So the underground water table is also declining. At the same point of time, the roots are not able to penetrate deeper and reach to this underground water as well, thus obviously declining the soil productivity altogether. Also, if we refer to the Indian Express data, from where this particular graph has been taken, it tells us that how, if we are using, let's say for example 100 gram of urea for the growth of a particular crop, the crop is only able to use 37% of this urea or 37 gram of this urea in its entire growth cycle. Thus almost 63% of urea actually remains idle, or it gets leaches into the nearby water body, creating what? Algal blooms, increasing the chemical oxygen and biological oxygen demand of the water, leading to the issue of eutrophication. Also, the issue of bioaccumulation and biomagnification ultimately leads to the contamination of food crop itself, which you guys are actually eating. Thus, to tackle with this issue, to actually solve the crop productivity, the government basically brought a nutrient-based subsidy scheme, which basically includes your diammonium phosphate as well as muriate of potash, where government is saying that see, we are going to now incentivize the farmer to use an ideal fertilizer ratio, and that is N is to P is to K shall be 4 is to 2 is to 1. So this nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, these are basically the macronutrients which are required for the growth of the crop. The government is saying that the cropping ratio, the cropping production and the use of kind of fertilizer ratio shall be at this level. For this purpose, the government is now providing per term subsidy to manufacturers and importers on the basis of the ratio of this fertilizer uses. So let's say for example, there is a company A, and this company A is making a fertilizer. In this fertilizer, nitrogen is the most harmful. After that there is P, and then there is K. If the N ratio is high, the government is saying that if the N ratio is high in this particular fertilizer, then you are going to get less subsidy from the government. So now basically the kind of the subsidy which is being provided by the government is actually going to be based upon the nutrients which are actually has been utilized to create the fertilizer. Also, there exists kind of an informal control design, where the government is basically saying that okay, let's say for example, there is a particular farmer who is kind of importing such kind of fertilizer from outside the country, then there is a maximum profit which that particular kind of the importer shall incur, and that shall be, let's say, 5% or 10%. So if there is a limit on profit, that basically disincentivizes this particular importer to import the fertilizer altogether. So by this purpose also the fertilizer use will decline. The reason for that is that the government is actually now trying to put impetus upon organic farming under Paramparagat Krishi Vikas Yojana, which is basically a subcomponent under your National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture. And this Parampragat Krishi Vikas Yojana was actually launched in the year of 2016, where the government basically tries to incentivize the organic farming. But the input cost for organic farming in the beginning years is actually more costlier than the use of fertilizer. So how the government will do that? The government said that, okay, if we refer to the National Agriculture Commission data, 86% of the farmers in our country are small and marginalized, so they have very less land holding. What government is doing under this Parampragat Krishi Vikas Yojana, it is basically kind of putting impetus upon a cluster-based development program, where what government has done? Government has, let's say, basically brought 50 small farmers, small and marginalized farmers who have small land areas adjacent to each other, and has created a cluster of 20 hectares. So now in this 20 hectare, in the large scale area, there will be cultivation of organic crop. The government is saying that whatever the input cost which you will incur, the government is going to provide 50,000 rupees per hectare every 3 years to these farmers, thus incentivizing the use or the cultivation of organic crops altogether. Then, now when these particular farmers are growing these crops, the government is also saying that if you are using fertilizer, we are going to create a kind of a soil profile for the land which you own, and we will exactly tell you what is the ideal ratio of fertilizer for the growth of the crops in your particular soil. For that, the government has brought soil health card scheme, where they basically kind of checks 12 parameters of the land of the farmer. 12 parameters basically use your macronutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, or micronutrients which we are discussing, zinc, iron, folic acid, etc. And on the basis of these 12 parameters, a kind of a ideal soil fertilizer ratio is provided which is suitable for that particular land. And now to teach the farmers about these methods of organic farming as well as this ideal fertilizer ratio, the Krishi Vigyan Kendras are being created at the grassroots level. The second problem which this Dhan Dhan Krishi Yojana actually envisages to tackle, that is the less credit disbursement. So if we refer to the All India Rural Credit Survey, which is actually released by Reserve Bank of India itself, back in the year of 2020, the share of institutional credit was only 66%. So that basically implies that 34% of the total credit which were taken by the farmers were actually of informal in the nature, taken by some Mahajan, taken by some, let's say, Sahukar, money lenders, or for example the close relatives of the families who are basically charging heavy interest rate, because these credits are not being kind of delivered to the farmers through the institutionalized channel. Thus, the total outstanding debt of the farmers actually amounted to 14 lakh crore, and almost 4.5 lakh crore of these total debt was informal in the nature. What is the reason for such less credit disbursement? When we are saying credit disbursement, we are basically implying formal credit disbursement through the banks, like for example regional rural banks or National Agriculture Bank for Rural Development. So why the kind of the credit delivery is not being taken place from such formalized sources? The major reason for that is the kind of the small and marginalized land holding which these farmers have. So for example, if you go to a regional rural bank and you say that, can you please give us a loan? The RRB is basically saying that if we give loan to this small farmer has a very small land area, he will not be able to cultivate a large production. Thus, there are chances that he might default on the loan altogether. Or for example, many of the times these banks, they ask for some collateral. These small and marginalized farmers do not have such any kind of capital asset to provide as a collateral except for the land which they have. Even the land which they have, many of the time there exists unclear land title due to the outdated records or the tenancy laws which has a kind of a colonial past. Then, if the profit maximization is a factor which is being considered by these banks, don't you think that with the increasing issue of climate change and extreme weather events, so there can take place what? A flash flood, a cloud burst. So now the banks has actually become much more reluctant to give the formal loans to these farmers. And yes, obviously the kind of prevailing issue of inadequate banking infrastructure, specifically in the remote areas. Just look at the report which was provided by RBI last year itself, where it said that how almost 30 to 40% of the rural hamlets does not have a nearby regional rural bank. So what are the steps which the government has taken? First and foremost, the government has basically utilized the technology, for example, geographical information system and drone technology, a question which appeared in your mains paper this year, where the government has basically utilizing this technology to create what? Digital land records for the farmers, and thus providing them kind of property cards under the Swamitwa scheme. Then the government is also providing assurance to the farmers in the case of external calamities. Let's say, for example, cloudburst is taking place. The government is saying that whatever the loss will be incurred to your crop, that will be insured by the government under your Fasal Bima Yojana, in which not only your staple crops like rice, wheat and pulses are secured, but also various crops like tea and coffee. The perennial crops has also been included. So now this particular scheme of Fasal Bima Yojana is actually applicable for your both Kharif as well as Rabi season. Further, the government is actually incentivizing collateral loans which are now being provided to the farmers at a minimal interest rate under your Kisan credit card, the Agricultural Infrastructural Fund, as well as the PM formalization of micro food enterprises. Then the government is saying that why you require this formal credit? To kind of incur the cost of input cost. So the government is saying that if you want a kind of a income support, we have a direct benefit transfer scheme, and that is Pradhan Mantri Kisan Samman Nidhi, under which 6,000 rupees is provided annually in 3 equal installments every 4 months. So with the help of this, the farmers can actually take care of the input cost which they are incurring. So if we refer to the report which was published in PIB, it said that how the ground level agricultural credit disbursement has actually reached 19.28 lakh crore for the fiscal year of 24-25. However, keep another data in your mind that there was a survey which was conducted by Food and Agriculture Organization among Indian farmers, where if you look at this, I am not planning on using. Almost 50% of the farmers said that they are not planning to use digital payment. 47% were actually reluctant to crop insurance, and 57% were actually apprehensive to not use any kind of equipment insurance. So this is a major issue which we also need to tackle. Also, one more particular scheme which we also very recently we were discussing about the issue of cotton production, if you guys can recall. So there is another scheme which has been launched in the budget 2025, and that is the mission for cotton productivity, where there were various supply side issues which we had discussed, if you guys can recall, that how almost 67% of the cotton producers in our country, specifically from the regions of Gujarat and Maharashtra, they are actually reliant on monsoon rainfall. Now again, this monsoon rainfall can actually get disturbed by various climatic factors, the increasing global warming, the extreme weather events like cloudburst, for example, or if El Nino takes place and creates kind of drought-like situation. So don't you think these 67% farmers will now be vulnerable to the various kind of climate vagaries? At the same time, you guys have already read and very well understood about the declining soil fertility in our country because of the various reasons. Then these cotton crops. So remember, when we talk about the cotton, which is basically a kharif crop, and India is the only country in the world who actually produces all 4 types of cotton, where we actually kind of constitutes 18% of the global cotton production. This particular crop is also being impacted by the pink bollworm, and that is leading to the declining area under the cotton production, if you guys can see here. From 2022 to 23 to 24, the cropping area under the cotton production has kind of consistently declined. Then there exists production side issues as well. The less mechanization to the prevalence of small scale industries, the various micro, small and medium enterprises. The rising cost of raw material itself. If the cotton production is declining in our country, the input cost is increasing. So the raw material cost has increased, less profit margin for the producers. At the same time, limited market access which we have. Considering that in the international market there is high scale demand of long staple cotton, however the cotton which we grow majorly in our country, that is hybrid cotton. So, what are the steps which has been taken by the government of India to increase the crop production despite this cotton productivity mission which we have launched in the budget 2025? First and foremost, the National Mission on Cotton, under which we are actually focusing on HTBT cotton and integrated pest management. Then there exists a Central Institute for Cotton Research, where we are actually trying to develop climate resilient high yield variety cotton seeds. Then under your National Food Security Mission, there also exists a kind of a sub-component, and that is Sub-Mission on Cotton, where the various producers of the cotton, the government is basically distributing through the use of these Krishi Vigyan Kendras, micronutrients, biopesticides, etc. Also, remember that cotton is not procured under the minimum support price. However, under the PM Asha or Annadata Aay Sarakshan Abhiyan, there exists a kind of a price support scheme for cotton where the Cotton Corporation of India actually procures cotton at a kind of a floor wages. Also, the cotton cultivation is also included under the Mission for Integrated Development for Horticulture. This 5-year mission for cotton productivity launched in the budget 2025 to facilitate significant improvements in productivity and sustainability of cotton, use of best science and technology support, aligning with our integrated 5F vision for the textile to increase the income of the farmers, ensure supply of quality cotton. Then there were certain other schemes which were mentioned in the today's article. The schemes like, for example, establishment of a Makhana board in Bihar, mission for Atmanirbharta in pulses, specifically Tur, Urad and Masoor. Then there is a comprehensive program for vegetable and fruits and national mission on high yielding seed. Beside this, there were certain other initiatives which were actually listed on your PYB when the budget was launched. For example, the second gene bank with 10 lakh germplasm line to be set up. Your Kisan credit card loan limit which has now been raised to 5 lakh rupees. 12.7 lakh metric tons urea plant which will be set up in Assam. And how there will be a specific impetus on Andaman and Nicobar where there will be a new framework for sustainable harnessing of fisheries. So keep all of these initiatives in your mind, a kind of a comprehensive coverage for your agriculture sector. Try to attempt this particular question and we move forward to the next news, where the article highlights that how the people with disabilities have actually never accounted for more than 1.1% of the government employees even a decade has taken place after the enactment of Right of Person with Disabilities Act of 2016, which forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the issues arising from the government policies and interventions. So the first question which shall come in your mind is that who are these disabled people? So if we refer to the definition which has been given to us by the World Health Organization, these are the people who basically face impairment or kind of, if they are doing any kind of activity, any kind of learning, or if they face participation restrictions in doing such activities which actually occurs very normal for the other human beings. And as per the UN Convention for the Right of Person with Disabilities, these disabled people, they basically form kind of an invisible minority where the people who are suffering from various kind of disabilities actually numbers almost 1.3 billion people globally. If we refer to the Ministry of Social Justice reply to a question which was asked in the Parliament back in the Lok Sabha 2024, it basically told us that how in our country at that point of time, almost 2.68 crore people or almost 2.21% of the population were suffering from one or another kind of disability. Keep this in mind that as per the UNCRPD, almost 80% of such disabled people occurs or lives in developing countries and almost 70% of them actually resides in rural areas. If we are talking specifically about our country, the people who are basically facing some kind of impairment in movement, they constitute 54 lakh people. The people who are actually facing the kind of impairment or disability in hearing or seeing, they constitute almost 50 lakh each. So, to provide certain rights and specific care facilities to these people, the government enacted Right of Person with Disabilities Act 2016, under which almost 21 categories of disabilities has been listed. like for example blindness, leprosy cured person, locomotor disability if a person is suffering from, let's say, polio or leprosy, dwarfism, intellectual disability, mental illness, any kind of specific learning disability, or for example if you are facing impairment in your hearing, you are having muscular dystrophy. Sometimes even the kind of the barbarism which still prevails in humanity actually kind of surfaces, and that showcases that how there are certain disabled people who are actually victim of acid attacks or Parkinson disease, thalassemia, hemophilia. You guys can actually recall that when we talk about the Anemia Mukt Bharat Abhiyan, and specifically in the context of Ministry of Tribal Affairs, who has set up a target that by the year of 2047, they will eliminate the issue of sickle cell anemia among the tribal women. So sickle cell disease is also considered as one of the disability under this particular act itself. Sickle cell anemia basically means, anemia basically implies that how there is a clotting of red blood cells which are taking place. The red blood cells which are basically essential carrier of oxygen in your body, and thus can very significantly impact your overall immune system. So these are various disabilities which has been listed under the Right of Person with Disabilities Act 2016. What are the specific provisions which has been provided? So first and foremost, the act basically expanded the right to equality which has been guaranteed by the Constitution under Article 14, and said that such people who are basically facing such disability, they shall be provided with accessibility and reasonable accommodation. The section 3 of the act specifically says that no person shall be discriminated on the ground of disability, thus kind of upholding their right to dignified life under Article 21 of the Constitution. The same act also provides that how under Right to Education Act 2009, which we were very recently discussing, these people who are basically suffering from one or other kind of disability, they are actually provided free and elementary education from the year of 6 to 18 years. So keep this in mind that under the normal provisions of RTE Act 2009, the people are providing or getting free and elementary education up to the age of 14 years only. However, in the case of disabled people, the age limit has increased to 18 years. Then it also lists down high penalties for offences, directs the central as well as the state government to create a fund to provide amenities to these disabled people, and also set up certain special courts for the faster adjudication of cases. Then there was another particular provision which was listed in the act itself, where it actually increased the quota of the reservation for these disabled people to 4% in the government jobs and 5% in the higher education. So to kind of provide them opportunity to first and foremost get educated, and then ultimately have access to certain public jobs to create financial independence and financial inclusion of them. However, this particular provision of the act has remained a dead letter, as it has been showcased in the today's article, where despite the 2016 law raising the reservation to 4% in the union government jobs, it has never crossed actually more than 1.1%, where Group A has the lowest share, Group B only constitutes 1.53%, Group C, that is non-Safai Karmchari, 1.1%, and in Group C, which actually includes Safai Karmchari, suddenly the number increases to 1.93%. So their numbers have stayed between 20,000 to 22,000 from 2016 to 22, making up just 1% of the public workforce. Thus, in the backdrop of this, what are the issues which are actually being faced by these disabled people? The first and foremost is there exists no data-based policy making. So remember that after the conducting of census 2011, that is the only official data which we have for these disabled people. And unless and until a new census data is released, we do not have any official data for such disabled people. Thus, if we refer to the data which has been provided to us by a research report of Indian Express, only 28.8% of the people with disabilities actually held disability certificate. 21% actually received some kind of aid from the government, and 1.8% were actually receiving help from various kind of NGOs. Don't you think this basically marks a kind of a grave case for policy blindness?
So there are a lot of eligible individuals, disabled people, who are in the grave need of such benefits of the government aid, and they are actually being devoid of that. Thus, the inequity which prevails in our larger country and society, that still persists. Then there is a kind of a great example of the policy paralysis by the government itself, where there exist discriminatory tax barriers which the government is imposing on these people, where there exists high taxation on assistive devices like, for example, your prosthetic limbs, wheelchair, hearing aids, braillers, etc. Even on the medical aid. We are talking about the GST reforms which has taken place, the GST 2.0. Just look at the newspaper article. GST on assistive devices. Why the people with disabilities are actually being taxed for their survival. For example, wheelchairs, hearing aids, crutches, braille paper and the screen readers, they still attract 5% GST. Thus, don't you think that will ultimately translate to what? High out-of-pocket expenditure by these people. If we refer to the World Health Organization data, this out-of-pocket expenditure almost accounts for 50% of the total health expenditure for the Indians. Then we are talking about these people who are reflecting in 1.1% job or having 1.1% public jobs. So don't you think that is also implying that there does not exist jobs for these people, and thus they do not have financial independence, and thus in the lack of such economic kind of accountability or insurance, don't you think they cannot afford this out-of-pocket expenditure at all? So the data which we have for these disabled people, it actually comes from various NSO survey, where just look how the prevalence of disability was among 2.2 to 2.3% in rural and 2% in urban areas. Among male it was 2.4 and among female it was 1.9%. But despite such numbers, if we look at the budget allocation by the government to provide various amenities or provide health care to these persons with disability as a percentage of GDP, that has actually significantly declined in the recent years. Then there exist issues with the right of person with disability rules 2023 itself, where there were certain good provisions which were actually included in the act, which could have actually led to kind of significant changes for the lives of such disabled people. For example, the Rule 15, it actually provided the accessibility norms for your information and communication technology products to enable digital inclusion. So for example, it basically directed that if there is a website which is being created or an app which is being created, it shall be made user friendly for such disabled people also. Now after hearing this, just go and open any government website and see how disabled people friendly they are actually. Then this particular rule actually directed the various public institutions to create ramps, accessible toilets and transportation for disabled. Now look at the non-accessible India, a survey of public building which was actually conducted by UNESCO representative, where they found that 50% of such buildings did not have ramps, 25% actually had the availability of wheelchair and 5% had tactile paving. Thus, they basically commented, which was basically published in the newspaper, that how only 3% of the public buildings in India are actually fully accessible. Then the rule said that, okay, what we are going to do, we are going to provide a unique disability identity cards to all of these individuals, and we will classify them on the basis of the kind of impairment which they have. So for example, let's say if I am 40% hearing impaired, then I will be listed in white. If I am more than 40%, then I will be listed in yellow. Or if more than 80%, then I will be classified as a red UDID. Then there was a kind of a provision for registration of medical authority on this unique disability identity card portal. The idea was that such medical authority will examine a person who is facing for such disability and will provide such UDID within the provision of 3 months. But now look at the shortcomings. First and foremost is that such accessibility standards which were listed, they are actually treated as advisory and not mandatory, because there does not exist any compliance system or any penalty mechanism. So if a public building does not have a ramp, does not have a wheelchair, will there be any penal provisions for them? Absolutely not. Why? Because it is only advisory in the nature. Then just imagine a rural area where there does not exist a specialty care. First of all, even if it exists, there exists lack of health infrastructure. specialist doctors, diagnostic equipment, to actually diagnose such people who are facing such disability and provide them this card. If you don't have this card, you cannot avail any kind of government scheme. Now, let's say for example, somehow this medical health authority actually existed, diagnosed me and said that I am 40% hearing impaired, which I am. And then it told me to go to take the help of, let's say for example, some government scheme. I want some, let's say to work under the MG-Narega scheme, but under the MG-Narega scheme, to avail that, under the Aadhaar Act of 2015, because the scheme is being charged on Consolidated Fund of India, I would be required to have a proof of identity or Aadhaar card. Now imagine if I am not hearing impaired, rather, let's say for example, if I am blind, I do not have cornea, or I do not have hand to actually, put the fingerprint, how my biometric authentication will take place. And if it will not take place, I will not be provided with Aadhaar card. If I don't have Aadhaar card, how I will avail under the MG-Narega scheme even if I want to work? So all of these entry barriers which exist, they are further augmented and lead to violation of fundamental right. First and foremost is the social stigma, where in our society there exists a complete absence of awareness about the various kind of mental health diseases or disabilities which actually exist. A very classic example of that and very vividly depicted was in the Tare Zameen Par movie, if you guys can actually recall, where the protagonist Ishan was actually suffering from dyslexia, and thus he was unable to comprehend a particular piece of information in a particular same speed as the other people. Being completely ignorant of the health condition which he was suffering from, his parents kept on criticizing him and thus ultimately led him to depression. So such entry barriers which exist actually kind of prevent these people to get educated or get job. For example, as per the Ministry of Social Justice estimation, only 50 to 55% of such disabled people are literate, and almost 60% of them remain unemployed, thus they do not have any financial independence or medical insurance. Look at the data here. 80% of disabled people actually lack health insurance. 42% even does not have heard about the government's flagship program, that is Ayushman Bharat Jan Arogya Yojana. Then the digital divide which persists. So if we refer to the data, there was 47% internet penetration in rural areas in 2022. Now imagine, in the absence of user-friendly ICT for such disabled people, can they use or have equal access to the internet? They cannot have. If they don't have, don't you think they will ultimately be able kind of render to have an inability to actually get into the industry 4.0, which is working on artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data analytics, and thus ultimately leading to the violation of their fundamental rights. The same thing was also highlighted by the former Chief Justice of India, D.Y. Chandrachud, when he was passing a judgment, which we'll read a bit later, where he basically said that how there also exist gendered vulnerabilities among the disabled people, as the women people who are actually disabled, they are actually more prone to, they can be very easily sexually exploited. There can be more imposition on social discrimination, ostracization on them. So these are the various major issues which are being faced by these people, and thus what are the steps which has been taken till now? So first and foremost is the Accessible India campaign or Sugamya Bharat Abhiyan, under which, look at the achievements. The government buildings are now being retrofitted with accessibility features. 709 railway stations has now been made fully accessible. All 35 international airports now have accessibility features such as, for example, ramps, braille systems, etc. Then there exists a Spark project by International Labour Organization, International Food and Agriculture Development, where basically what they are trying to do, they are trying to sensitize the rural community by training such disabled people at the grassroots level to kind of engage them into community development. Similarly, there was a social awareness campaign, GLAD network of UNESCO, where they are basically trying to bring these people at the center of policy making. A very brilliant initiative which shall become a kind of a part of your answer, that is Nirmay initiative by the Chhattisgarh government. Under this Nirmay initiative, Chhattisgarh government is not only providing them free medical aid, supplying them various kind of assistance devices like, for example, wheelchair, hearing aid, etc. Also, they are basically kind of educating them to make them skilled enough to actually procure certain jobs. One very key feature of this Nirmay initiative by Chhattisgarh government is where they are basically kind of appointing one disabled people per panchayat, and this person actually participates in the decision making which takes place, so that their grievances are also actually featured in the policy making. And obviously India has adopted the United Nations Convention for Right of People with Disabilities back in the year 2006 itself. What can be the innovative way forward? First and foremost, we need to implement the Article 41, the directive principle of state policy, which direct the state to provide public assistance in the case of disability. Then there was a specific Supreme Court judgment in Rajiv Raturi versus Union of India, where the Supreme Court directed the government of the day to develop minimum mandatorily accessibility requirements. The Section 48 of Right of People with Disabilities Act actually provides for regular social audit of the scheme. We can also adopt the global best practices, like how the Canada is actually applying to become kind of achieve full accessibility in all public spheres by 2040. At the same time, with the development of technology, like for example, there is a Rewalk Robotics, which has actually developed bionic limbs with sensory feedback. These are the kind of the technology developments for which the government shall actually provide more financial assistance for. Keep all of this way forward in your mind, attempt this question, and we move forward to the next news, where in a very succinct manner we'll try to cover the mental health aspect, as there has been a report which has been published by the World Health Organization called as Mental Health Atlas 2024, where the report has highlighted that how more than 1 billion people are actually living with mental health disorders across the world, and these conditions also include the anxiety and depression, thus calling for greater investment and actions which are actually required globally now to scale up the services to protect and promote the mental well-being of an individual. Now you guys can recall that when we are talking about the issue of student suicide, how the National Crime Record Bureau data has actually suggested us that the student suicide has specifically increased to more than 13,000 in the year of 2024 itself, thus kind of reflecting the prevailing issue of anxiety and depression even among the youth of our country. If we refer to the Lancet Psychiatry Commission, 197 million Indians actually suffer from anxiety, depression, and various kind of substance use. Thus, this kind of the mental health issues which are being faced by the people, that has become the second leading cause of disability and high out-of-pocket expenditure. Then there exists a specific United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, that is 3.4, which has basically kind of set up a target, and that target is to achieve 33% reduction in suicide rates by 2030. The report, the atlas which has been published in today's article, that basically says that the current trajectory which is being kind of followed by the various governments of the world, only 12% reduction is possible. So these are certain specific data which will actually become the introduction of your answer if a question appears on mental health. Any one of them can be used. If you are talking specifically about the women, you can actually write that how 2x more women actually attempt suicide than men. Women have consistently higher rates of anxiety and disorders because of the various kind of discrimination, ostracization, and entry barriers which they face at various levels. Almost 2x as likely as men are there to develop depression. So this atlas provides us that how this cost of depression and anxiety on global economy is around $1 trillion a year. And only 45% of countries has enacted laws in the compliance with the WHO standard. Then obviously there exists a kind of a gap between the kind of the investments which are being made in this regard to actually kind of take care of the mental health of the people. When we talk about the developed nations, high income countries, $65 per person is being invested. If we talk about the low income countries, this particular investment actually comes down to as abysmal as $0.04. Then if we refer to the global median of the mental health workers, that is 13 per 1 lakh people, and only 10 countries have actually transitions to the community based care models. The question arises, what are the causes of deteriorating mental health specifically in our country? The first and foremost is the invisible leash of capitalism and the competitive environment in which we are living. That basically arises for a reason, and that is the poverty of aspiration. If you guys can recall how it was coined by the then chief economic advisor, where it said that, let's say for example in our country, if we refer to the multidimensional poverty index, 18% of the population is multidimensionally poor. So now if you want to actually kind of get out of this vicious cycle of poverty, you actually become the part of a rat race. A rat race which does not recognizes any of your worker right, which does not have any scope for your mental health, and thus ultimately you become the part of the grinding culture and the burnout among the workforce, where we actually take pride that how much we are working. You used to study for 16 hours, I am studying for 18 hours. There are certain people who might be watching this lecture who have not slept for the last 6 days. Also, this is basically because of the curse of generational poverty, the over-competitive environment ultimately leading to that poster boy syndrome, that how there was this one particular person who did all of this hard work and ultimately got succeeded and broke this vicious cycle of poverty, for which there will come more 1 lakh people to actually fight for that one limited seat, leading to this grinding culture and burnout among the workforce. Also, let's say for example, if you are facing anxiety and depression and you tell this to your family, there exists a kind of a lack of awareness about it, as we were discussing in the case of disabled people. So that leads to social stigma and discrimination, ultimately ostracization and exclusion. Then the rapid urbanization and migration which has taken place, that has led to the loss of social support. Why? Because of the nuclear family structure which has developed. So the care system which was basically being provided by the joint family earlier, that has been diluted. Also, the digitalized world in which we are leading to, that is basically kind of creating echo chamber, the silos of intrusive thoughts, where there exists an influencer economy. See, I am in Paris. See, I am buying this new thing. You don't know the reality of that. But what that basically drives you into, that is the relative deprivation. Also in our country, there also exists the kind of the various societal taboos, like for example in tribal practices, there exists the issue of witch hunting by Rabhas and Bodos, who does not have any idea about the issues of mental health, ultimately exacerbating what? The prevailing gender inequalities. Then if we talk about the status of mental health care in our country, just look at the World Health Organization data, where the burden of mental health problem in India is approximately 2,443 disability adjusted years, which are lost per 1 lakh population. Why? Because of the issue of anxiety and depression. As per National Institute of Mental Health, 80% people do not have access to mental health care services. Or for example, if you look at the National Health Service data, there exist 0.7 psychiatrists and 0.07 psychologists per 1 lakh population in India. So what is the government response? The lack of public expenditure, where first of all the government expends less than 2% of GDP on the healthcare sector as whole, and only 0.05% of GDP is directed towards the mental health, leading to several impacts, like for example at an individual level, where you are facing immense personal distress, difficulty in maintaining personal and professional relationship, increasing out of pocket expenditure. As an economy as whole, this demographic dividend, don't you think their work efficiency is reducing? The issue of job shirking is taking place. The decreased overall productivity and thus denting our demographic dividend altogether. So to tackle with this issue, there are certain steps which has been taken by the government of India, which you guys can write in your way forward, which is National Mental Health Policy 2003, to modernize the state mental health hospital and filling the shortage of the qualified professional. Mental Health Act 2017, which decriminalized the suicide attempts for individuals with mental illness. The National Suicide Prevention Strategy of 2022, under which the government has launched a Kiran helpline to provide support to the people who are actually feeling anxiety or stress. Then there also exists the Manas app to promote the mental well-being across the various age groups. What can be the innovative steps which we can take? First and foremost, to sensitize the people about the importance of mental health, to actually use artificial intelligence to monitor a person's well-being, to use advanced biotechnology method, like for example this direct current synchronization system which has been created, which can actually kind of inculcate the pulses in your mind. And then the integration of the mental health care to the primary health care and its awareness and dissemination to the grassroots level by the use of ASHA workers, the accredited social health activist. So you can write all of this. write the SDG in your conclusion and we move forward to the next news. We will try to understand that what are these new Foreigner Tribunals Act which has been enacted by the government. So what is the context of the news? The Union Ministry of Home Affairs has recently notified rules, orders and exemption order which made the Immigration and Foreigners Act 2025 operational. This particular act has actually repealed and replaced several acts like, for example, Passport Act 1920, Registration of Foreigners Act 1939, the Foreigners Act 1946 and the Immigration Act of 2000. So what are the changes which has been introduced by this particular Foreigners Act of 2025? Let's try to understand that. First and foremost, what was the rationale behind enacting this particular act? Because there existed multiplicity and overlapping of laws on passports, travel documents, etc. And to actually regulate the foreigners' registration and immigration issues. Then this act has actually empowered the Bureau of Immigration, where now they can actually examine the cases of immigration fraud, and this has been for the first time in the act. Second, they also need to coordinate with the state government, and together with the state government, this Bureau of Immigration will actually identify, restrict or deport the movement of the foreigners. Then for the identification of the foreigners for the first time, their biometric information will also be registered. They will also get Aadhaar card. Anyway, even the foreigner can get Aadhaar card in our country. And it will be enforceable through the executive order of the Ministry of Home Affairs. Then the educational institutes will inform the foreigners, regional registration officers about all the foreign students. And just like how your parents might be asking about the numbers which you guys are scoring in the various tests which you guys are attempting, even these educational institutes will have to submit semester-wise academic performance and the general conduct report of these foreigners, that whether they are here for study or for protest. Now the question arises, can foreigners actually participate in protest? Now let's look that does these provisions, do they violate any fundamental rights of the foreigners? The answer is that there are certain fundamental rights which are not available to the foreigners. Like for example, Article 15 and 16. Which basically prohibits the state to perform any kind of discrimination and provide for equality of opportunity in the public employment. But this is not available to the foreigners. So don't worry, they cannot appear for UPSC yet. Second, Article 19, freedom of speech, assembly, association, movement, residence and profession can be curtailed for a foreigner. That is the idea. So for example, if you are here, your academic performance will be seen, that you are here for study or you are basically protesting in Jantar Mantar, like how foreigners are doing in the Nepal protest. Then Article 29 and 30, which provides for cultural and educational rights of the minorities, that is also not available for the foreigners. In this regard, there are certain important Supreme Court judgments. First is Louis de Reed versus Union of India 1991, where Supreme Court specifically held that such foreigners does not have any right to reside or settle in India. In NHRC versus State of Arunachal Pradesh 1996, specifically in the case of Chakma refugees, Supreme Court held that the state shall protect the life and liberty of foreigners under Article 21, which is available to them. And in Hans Muller case 1955, the Supreme Court had earlier set a precedent where it has said that government has all the power to expel a foreigner. Just look at the foreign tourists who are visiting in India, and if we talk about their state-wise number, right? 17% to Maharashtra, 14% to Gujarat, 14% to Bengal, 10% approximately to Delhi. Now, what are the power of foreigner tribunal under the Act? First and foremost, such foreigner tribunal has now been listed as to have a power of the first class judicial magistrate. They can actually send a person to detention or hold if no proof of being foreigner. Now remember that under the Foreign Tribunal Order of 2025, such foreigners tribunal can actually issue arrest warrant if a person fails to appear whose nationality has been contested. So let's say, for example, if I was walking on the street and some people basically said that no, you are you a foreigner? And I said that yes, I am, and I belong to this particular country. So I need to show my documents. If I'm unable to do that, then an arrest warrant can be issued by the foreigner tribunal. This exercise or this provision is very important for the National Register citizens, an RC exercise which is taking place in Assam and only in that particular state, which has more than 100 plus operational foreign tribunals. Under this NRC, it has actually excluded 19 lakh people out of the total 3.2 crore applicants. There is also a kind of a composition which has been classified in the act itself, where the number of the members will be 3, and any appeal against the decision of this foreigner tribunals will be decided within the span of 30 days. The role of security forces like Border Security Force or Assam Rifle or Coast Guard is to prevent illegal migrants attempting to enter India and capture their biometric detail and then send them back. So if they are, let's say for example, crossing the wire, then first have their biometric authentication. Okay, done. Now go back. Take. We move forward to the next news. According to which 60% of India's outward foreign direct investment actually goes to tax havens. Let's try to understand first the context of the news, where it says that how the Indian companies like, let's say for example, Adani, Ambani, they are actually increasingly leveraging low tax jurisdictions, that basically implies tax havens, abroad to channel their foreign investments in a bid to increase their global presence. So nearly 56% of such outward FDI investment were in the low tax jurisdictions which are called as tax havens, like for example Singapore, Mauritius, United Arab Emirates, Netherlands, United Kingdom and Switzerland. So the question which shall be coming in your mind, what is foreign direct investment? What is foreign portfolio investment? In foreign direct investment, any particular investor actually try to acquire direct ownership of the business or the asset. In FPI, such owner only purchases financial assets, like let's say for example someone is buying stocks and not directly investing in the company or taking a majority stake holding of that. Second, in this FDI, investor actually seeks significant control over the company. Obviously, if I have brought, let's say for example, certain share of a company, it doesn't mean that the tomorrow Ambani is going to call me in the meeting and make me sit there, right? So investor has little or no control over the company, obviously. FDI, because I'm investing in this company, I'm now involved in the business and in the prospect of the growth. Thus, it is typically in the long-term nature. Let's say for example, more than 10 years or more than a decade. In case of FPI, it is typically short terms, less than a year or so. FDI is generally actually considered higher risk for an investor. Why? Because now any such event which is taking place in the local economy is also going to have an impact on the investor. So for example, let's say if inflation is going to take place, that will also incur or kind of direct the profit and loss of mine. In case of FPI, it is generally lower risk as well. Because let's say for example, if there is rising inflation in Indian economy, the propensity to consume of the people is declining. I think that okay, the productivity will decline. I can just take out my FPI. And that's why you guys might be reading about the frequent FPI outflows which take place from Indian economy, which is also a signal that the economy is basically facing some kind of turbulence. Then FDI is obviously very beneficial for the country because it creates jobs, transfer technology, boost economic growth. FPIs provide capital for companies and contribute to the market liquidity. Now when we are talking about the outward FDI by the Indian firms, almost 22% of that is going to Singapore, 10% to Mauritius, UAE, Netherlands, UK. The idea is that these are basically tax haven countries. The question which shall come in your mind is that why? Why our Indian companies are investing in such tax haven countries? The article provides for that. The article says that, let's say for example, there is an Indian company, and now this Indian company wants to create a subsidiary either in USA or Europe, and thus the Indian company, let's say for example Ambani is trying to, let's say for example, set up a deal with Facebook. So when Facebook is actually entering into the business with Adani, the idea is that even Facebook will want that it obviously following the principle of profit maximization to pay less taxes. Thus, it is easier to set up a subsidiary in Europe or USA. The reason being that now the Facebook will actually see that okay, Ambani has certain investments in tax haven countries where it is required to pay less taxes, and thus it is easy to create a special purpose vehicle there. Having SPV in tax haven attracts the strategic investors like for example Facebook. At the same time, in the case of dilution, so let's say for example, if I want to dilute my stake in a company in India, whatever the capital which I am incurring, it is requiring, let's say 20% taxation. When I am diluting my stake in Singapore, and let's say for example it's a tax haven country, so there the capital gain tax is only 5%, It is very obvious that it will lead to what? Better tax positioning at the time of stake dilution in the tax haven countries in comparison to our country. Also, it is more flexible in transferring funds on day-to-day basis, and it can actually protect the Indian companies from the various kind of market shocks which they might face in our country. When we talk in the terms of inflow of FDI, which almost reached to the highest 729 billions. So the idea is majority of them, 24% comes from Singapore only, 10% comes from USA, 25% from Mauritius, 7% from Netherlands and 6% from Japan. The sectors which attract the most FDI flow, that is service sector, then there is computer software and hardware, then trading, and then the non-conventional energy. Just look at drug and pharmaceuticals are here, and the automobile industry. Keep all of these things in your mind. It can become a statement in your prelims examination. And we move forward to the next news, where we will quickly learn about what is HIV, why it has featured in the news. The reason for that is that in 1994, the researchers actually discovered an antibody named B12, which actually helped to neutralize this HIV far more effectively than the pooled plasma. This led to identifying the broadly neutralizing antibodies, or BNAB, which basically recognize the conserved regions of the viral envelope. Now a new study has featured, which has compared the world's 14 top BNABs against the Indian and the South African HIV variants. Indian strains has responded strongly to V3 glycan and CD4 sites antibodies in more positive manner. We'll try to understand even this, what is CD4 basically stands for. So what is HIV? HIV is basically a kind of a disease caused by a virus. The name of the virus itself is human immunodeficiency virus, which basically attacks whom? The helper cell. The helper cell or T cells. T cells which are specifically coded as CD4, as a commander 4. So what are these T cells? T cells are basically the T lymphocytes which actually mature in the thymus gland. And these are the type of white blood cells which are actually responsible for activating our immune system. If this HIV is left untreated, it ultimately transforms to acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. This transmission of virus can take place through the exchange of bodily fluids. So remember, do there exist any kind of treatment for HIV? The answer is absolutely yes, as we saw in the today's article as well. For example, there exists an antiretroviral therapy or pre-exposure prophylaxis. Now when we talk about the HIV's prevalence in our country, just look at the data. India's efforts has actually lowered the HIV cases by 44% in 13 years. If we talk about the cases, it is around 2.54 million people as per India HIV estimate 2023, released by the National AIDS Control Organization. The highest prevalence is in the state of Maharashtra, followed by Andhra Pradesh and then Karnataka. So what are the steps which has been taken by the government of India? First and foremost, HIV and AIDS Prevention and Control Act 2017 has been passed, which provides for prevention of spread and confidentiality of the people who are suffering from such disease because of the social taboo and stigma which prevails. Second, mass awareness campaign has been taken through the use of red ribbon clubs and ASHA workers. Also, there has been creation of Sampoorn Suraksha Kendra, which provides as a single window from the prevention till the treatment of HIV. Also, because it can actually spread from the bodily fluid. Then there is a needle syringe exchange program which has been launched at the local medical centers. And all of this is being actually implemented by the National AIDS Control Organization, NACO. So keep these facts in your mind. Keep this specific BNAB as well as V3 glycan and CD4 site antibodies in your mind, and we move forward to the last news of the day, where we'll quickly try to understand what is G7. Why it has been in the news? Because US has asked the G7 countries to ramp up the pressure on the countries who are buying Russian oil, including our country, to end the war in Ukraine. So basically the Donald Trump, who has basically kind of criticized India being a landromat country. What is a landromat country? The countries who are basically buying the Russian oil amidst the war which is taking place in Ukraine. Remember, Russia is the largest oil supplier to our country. What is G7? Is it a formal grouping? No. Because it is a grouping which is not created on the basis of any treaty and thus does not have any permanent office or secretariat. It is basically an informal grouping of all the countries which basically fought in the World War II. Just remember it as a hint. US, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan and Canada. These are basically listed as the advanced economies of the IMF. So for example, there is one such classification which is provided by the World Bank, the income classification, where it classifies the country into low income, lower middle income and upper middle income and high income countries. These are the high income countries. With our per capita GDP of $2,880, India currently falls in the category of lower middle income country. These countries basically kind of come at the convergence on the platforms of pluralism, democracy and representative government. Earlier there used to exist G8, but Russia was expelled from this G8 back in the year of 2014. For what reason? For the obvious reason, it attacked Ukraine. So the presidency basically rotates annually among the member states, and it is the host country which basically invite the other countries, like for example how Canada invited our Prime Minister in the recent G7 meeting which took place. The importance of this informal meeting is that it consists of 10% of the world population, but more importantly almost 1/3 of the world's GDP. However, there has been recent proposal to kind of change this G7 into E7, the emerging 7 countries, which includes our country as well, and China, Indonesia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Vietnam, who have large population, there's large propensity to consume, consist almost 20% of the global GDP, 47% of the market imports and 48% of the world population. And thus they can actually emerge as a kind of an alternative to the G7 countries. So keep all of this information in your mind. And with this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. So do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation and thank you.